I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths. This episode is based on publicly available historical reporting, FBI documents, and archival Kansas City Star coverage. All discussion of motives, conflicts, or organized crime involvement reflects documented investigative findings or widely accepted historical interpretation. No statements in this podcast are intended to accuse or imply wrongdoing by any living individual. This story is presented for informational and educational purposes only. On a spring night in 1973, a Kansas City mobster named Nick Spero walked out of his house and stepped into a storm he helped create. He was ambitious, restless, and no longer willing to play by the rules that kept the Civella crime family in power. In the world he lived in, ambition is dangerous. Ambition without permission is fatal. Spero had been circling the edges of the Kansas City mafia for years, respected by some, tolerated by others, and quietly watched by the people who really mattered. He wasn't a civilian. He wasn't innocent, but he also wasn't obedient, and that made him a problem. By 1973, tension between Spero and the Civella organization had reached a pressure point. He was challenging decisions, building influence, and making moves without approval. In a family built on discipline and hierarchy, this was open defiance. And defiance inside an American crime family has one ending. On the night of May 22nd, Nick Spero drove away from his home in Raytown and vanished. His car was later found abandoned. His body never returned. No police report, no crime scene, no autopsy, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. Within weeks, everyone in Kansas City's underworld knew exactly what had happened. Even if no one dared say it out loud, the Civella family had removed a threat permanently. There were no headlines, no public outcry, just a message delivered the way the mob always preferred, quietly, efficiently, and without the burden of a corpse to investigate. Nick Spero's disappearance didn't just eliminate a man, it restored order. It reasserted Civella authority at a moment when the organization was facing pressure from the FBI, from Las Vegas skim investigations, and from younger men who were getting impatient with the old hierarchy. Spero pushed too far. The mob pushed back harder, and Kansas City's crime family entered a new era of internal control. Tonight, we're going into the story behind that disappearance, who Nick Spero was, what he wanted, why he became a threat, and how his murder fit into the shifting power structure of a mob family on the edge of federal scrutiny. No fiction, no exaggeration. Just the real history of a man who challenged the wrong people at the wrong time and paid the price for it in the most absolute way. This is the internal mob purge that reshaped Kansas City. This is the murder of Nick Spero. And this is Deadly Truths. Before Nick Spero became a name whispered in Kansas City's mob circles, he was simply a man trying to carve out space in a world that rewarded loyalty and punished initiative. To understand why he vanished in 1973, you have to understand who he was and what made him different. Spero wasn't a top-ranking mob boss. He wasn't a Civella, a Moratina, or a DeLuna. He lived one tier down, close enough to see how power worked, but not close enough to wield it freely. Men like him kept the mob functioning, collecting debts, conveying messages, enforcing rules at street level, and maintaining the balance between business and violence. Inside the organization, people like Spero were essential, but also expendable. Still, Spero wasn't just another soldier. He had presence, he had ambition, and he had that dangerous combination of street credibility and independent thought. A mix that works well in the early stages of a criminal career and becomes a liability once a family consolidates power. Nick was known for his confidence and sometimes for his mouth. He wasn't the kind of man who quietly accepted decisions he disagreed with, and that alone created tension. Kansas City's mob wasn't a democracy, it was a hierarchy with Nicholas Civella at the top. The system thrived on order, obedience, and predictable behavior. Spero wasn't predictable. He had family too, the Spero brothers, and family inside the mob world is both armor and gasoline. Together, the Speros carried influence, not enough to replace the Civella family, but enough to remind the Civellas that they weren't the only men in Kansas City building networks. For a time, there was coexistence. Then the cracks appeared. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, outside pressures on the KC mob increased. FBI surveillance, Las Vegas skim scrutiny, and rivalries with other families that forced everyone to tighten their ranks. Under that pressure, loyalty became more important, and independence became more dangerous. Spero didn't adjust. He kept speaking up, kept challenging decisions, kept operating with a degree of autonomy the organization no longer tolerated. To the outside world, he was a mid-level mob figure with a dangerous reputation. To the inside, he was becoming a problem, not because he wasn't capable, but because he wasn't controllable. And that distinction in organized crime is the line between longevity and elimination. By 1973, Nick Spero wasn't just an ambitious man. He was an ambitious man in a shrinking system that no longer had room for free thinkers. The tension was already building. The fuse was already lit. All it needed was a final spark. Nick Spero didn't wake up one morning and find himself marked for death. His disappearance in 1973 was the end of a long, slow fracture, one that began quietly, almost invisibly, inside the Kansas City Mafia's own walls. Kansas City in the late 1960s was changing. Not on the surface. You'd still see the same bars, the same gambling dens, the same neighborhood faces. But underneath, the pressure was building. The FBI had ramped up surveillance. The Vegas skim was under scrutiny. Federal indictments were grinding through the system. Every move the Civella family made carried more weight and more risk. Inside that tightening world, obedience mattered more than ever. And that's where Nick Spero started to slip out of alignment. Spero had always operated with a sense of personal authority. He wasn't shy and he wasn't quiet. He spoke his mind even when wiser men kept their heads down. He had opinions about how things should be run, opinions he sometimes voiced in front of the wrong people. And he had the kind of confidence that made others watch him a little too closely. It wasn't just his personality that caused friction, it was his position. Nick's brothers, especially Carl Spero, were carving out their own footholds in Kansas City's criminal world. They weren't sanctioned leaders, but they weren't nobodies either. They had a presence, they had allies, they had ambition. And in organized crime, ambition spreads like fire if someone doesn't put it out. The Civella family, led by Nick Civella himself, had built their dynasty on order, on discipline, on a hierarchy that moved one direction, downward. You didn't question leadership. You didn't freelance. You didn't form your own power base. And above all, you didn't challenge the structure that kept the family intact during decades of federal heat. But the Spero brothers were beginning to look like their own faction, the kind of faction that could grow into a threat. Nick Spero wasn't trying to overthrow the mafia. His ambition was personal, not revolutionary. But in a criminal ecosystem, personal ambition can be interpreted as disloyalty. And disloyalty is interpreted as danger. By the early 1970s, whispers started circulating about deals Nick made without approval, about meetings he held that didn't travel back through the right channels, about money that wasn't flowing through the traditional hierarchy. Some of it was rumor, some was fact. But in organized crime, the difference doesn't matter. Perception kills as effectively as evidence. Tension between the Speros and the Civella organization didn't erupt in a single moment. It simmered, a disrespectful comment, a denied request, a dispute over territory or control, small slights that add up until the ledger becomes too heavy. A few incidents pushed things closer to the edge. There were arguments, heated ones, between Spero-aligned men and Civella loyalists. There were threats. There were warnings that looked like accidents and accidents that looked like warnings. Old-school mobsters started watching Nick more carefully. They noticed he was building influence, not a takeover, but a foothold. enough to matter, enough to raise eyebrows. And when the FBI spotlight turned hotter, the Civellas grew paranoid about loose ends. Anyone with a reputation for unpredictability suddenly became a liability. And Nick Spero, with his independence and his growing confidence, fit that profile too perfectly. For men like Nick Civella and Tuffy DeLuna, this wasn't personal. This was math. A man like Spero, smart, ambitious, restless, could destabilize the family if he kept rising. He could challenge decisions. He could encourage others to step out of line. He could weaken the chain of command when the family least needed it. By 1973, the quiet tension had become open watchfulness. No shouting matches, no public threats. Just the sense, shared by everyone who mattered, that something was coming. Nick Spero was moving in one direction, the organization was moving in another, and in the mafia, those opposing trajectories never end peacefully. The stage was set. Spero didn't know it yet, but everyone else did. Every time you hear a story like Nick Spero's, the same question rises to the surface. Why would anyone choose this life? Why stay connected to an organization where stepping out of line could get you beaten, disappeared, or dumped in a shallow grave? The answer isn't simple, and it's almost never moral. It's structural. First, the mob offered belonging. In neighborhoods where opportunity was limited, where outsiders controlled everything from loans to employment, the mafia functioned like an alternative system. Your group protected you, backed you, and made you feel like you mattered. Second, it offered money, steady, fast, and untaxed. For men who grew up watching their fathers work themselves into the ground for pennies, the mob offered something that looked like a shortcut. A dangerous shortcut, but one with visible results. Third, it offered power. Men who had no political voice could suddenly influence elections, business decisions, and neighborhood disputes. Respect, real or forced, came with the territory. But the biggest reason men stayed wasn't greed or glamour. It was gravity. Once you were in, you didn't simply walk away. The same network that provided protection also enforced loyalty. The same men who celebrated with you had the authority to kill you. The same hierarchy that lifted you up could erase you. For many, the mob wasn't a choice. It was an inheritance, a neighborhood tradition, a path handed down by older brothers, uncles, cousins. Not joining meant isolation. Joining meant danger. But danger felt manageable. Isolation didn't. So men like Nick Spero moved through this world accepting its rules, its rewards, and its consequences. They didn't think they'd be the ones to fall. Most didn't, until they did. In the end, the mafia wasn't a lifestyle people clung to because it was safe. They clung to it because it felt like the only structure that offered them identity, purpose, and a seat at a table they weren't invited to anywhere else. And that's why, even when the stakes turned lethal, the ties were hard to cut. Because the truth is, the mob wasn't just about crime. It was about belonging to something bigger than yourself, even if that something could swallow you whole. Nick Spero's end didn't come in a burst of violence or a dramatic ambush. It came the way real mob hits often do. Quietly, smoothly, without a ripple, in the moment it happens. And that's what makes his disappearance so chilling. In the days leading up to May 22nd, 1973, Spero's movements weren't unusual enough to draw attention. No frantic phone calls, no visible paranoia, no sign that he knew a storm was closing in. If he suspected danger, he kept it to himself. A common trait among men who lived closer to violence than the rest of us ever will. He was still running errands, still meeting contacts, still navigating the same underworld currents he always had. But underneath that routine, something had shifted. The tension between Spero and the Civella family wasn't whispered anymore. It was accepted fact. People in the life knew the lines were drawn. They just didn't know when they'd be crossed. On the evening he vanished, Spero left his home in Raytown in his car. There was no forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest he was tricked or dragged out. He walked out under his own power. He got into his car, and he drove away. What happened next is where the silence begins. Spero had a pattern: regular stops, familiar associates, predictable habits. But that night, he didn't follow any pattern. He didn't show up to planned meetings. He didn't make his usual late night calls. He simply disappeared into Kansas City's dark spaces, and the city absorbed him without a trace. The next morning, his car was found abandoned. No body, no blood, no signs of a struggle inside. If the goal was to eliminate him without leaving evidence, the execution was flawless. This wasn't an angry brawl or a chaotic murder. This was a coordinated removal, a message delivered through absence instead of spectacle. In mob circles, Spero's disappearance didn't require explanation. Men didn't ask questions. They didn't speculate out loud. They knew what it meant when someone with that much internal tension suddenly vanished. Authorities took the report, of course. They asked the basic questions. But without a crime scene, without witnesses, without a body, the case was a dead end before it ever started. Investigators suspected homicide. Kansas City knew it was homicide. But proving a murder without evidence, especially against an organized crime family, was nearly impossible. What we do know is this: Spero was last seen alive the night he drove away. His disappearance aligned with heightened mob tensions. Civella loyalists had motive, opportunity, and history on their side. Men in the underworld openly stated years later that the hit was ordered internally. The absence of a body wasn't an oversight. It was part of the design. Disposal without discovery was the Kansas City Mafia's most reliable eraser. Over the next days and weeks, Spero's name faded from public view, but not from mob memory. His disappearance sent an unmistakable message through the ranks. Ambition without permission could kill you, and the Civella family was still firmly in control. This wasn't just a murder, it was a correction. To understand why Nick Spero was eliminated, you have to understand the mindset of the Kansas City Mafia in the early 1970s. This was not a family operating at full strength and confidence. This was a leadership under pressure, legal, financial, and internal. And in moments like that, the margin for tolerated dissent shrinks to zero. The Civella family had ruled Kansas City for decades, not by accident, but through discipline and control. Every decision flowed down a chain of command. Every dollar was accounted for. Every associate was monitored, evaluated, and, when necessary, corrected. Internal peace wasn't a suggestion, it was a survival strategy. Nick Spero had become the kind of problem the organization couldn't afford. In a crime family, there are men who follow orders and men who push boundaries. Nick was the second kind. He took meetings without clearing them. He handled money his own way. He spoke his mind when silence was safer. He wasn't reckless, he was ambitious. But ambition becomes threatening when the boss interprets it as disloyalty. Spero wasn't staging a revolt, but he was behaving like a man who didn't fear the consequences of one. Nick wasn't alone. His brothers, especially Carl Spero, were also moving upward in their own circles. They weren't forming a rival family, but they were forming a bloc, a recognizable group with shared loyalty. In a stable family, this might have gone unnoticed, but in a family under pressure, it looked like a threat. A subgroup inside a crime organization is dangerous because it creates the potential for divided loyalty. And divided loyalty can turn into betrayal with a single federal indictment. By 1973, the FBI was deep into wiretaps, surveillance, and Vegas skim prosecutions. Every conversation mattered, every slip-up mattered. The old guard, Nick Civella, Tuffy DeLuna, Carl Corky Civella, were operating under a microscope. A man like Spero, unpredictable and outspoken, was a liability. Not because he would talk to the FBI, but because he couldn't be managed. When the pressure rises, the boss doesn't eliminate the biggest threats. He eliminates the most unpredictable ones. Reputation is currency in the mob. The more men who respect you, fear you, or follow your lead, the more dangerous you become to the hierarchy, even if that was never your intention. Nick Spero had charisma. He had presence. He carried himself like someone who expected a certain level of authority. That alone can be threatening in a family where authority is inherited, not earned. One of the biggest unspoken motives in many mob hits is the line between questioning leadership and challenging leadership. Nick didn't challenge Civella outright. He didn't make a move for power, but he acted in ways that suggested he didn't fear the men at the top. And in organized crime, fear is part of the structure. When someone behaves like the rules don't apply to them, executives start calculating the cost of letting them continue. Removing Nick Spero ended the tension between the Spero faction and the Civella faction, reasserted control for the family at a critical moment, sent a message to anyone else feeling restless, strengthened the leadership at a time federal heat demanded obedience. It wasn't personal, it wasn't emotional, it was organizational maintenance. In the mafia, a threat isn't defined by what a man has done, it's defined by what he could do if he keeps rising. And by 1973, the Civella family had concluded that Nick Spero's trajectory was no longer acceptable, so they ended it. How mob hits happen when the body is never meant to be found. Nick Spero didn't die in a dramatic shootout or a public ambush. His end followed a method that organized crime perfected long before Kansas City ever had a mafia: the silent elimination. When the mob decides a man has to go, there are two kinds of hits. The message hit, loud, messy, designed to scare everyone. The maintenance hit, clean, quiet, designed to erase a problem with no fallout. Nick Spero was the second kind. By 1973, the Civella family no longer needed to prove they were dangerous. Everyone already knew what they needed was control. Tight, contained, invisible control. That's why Nick's murder wasn't a bullet-riddled cleanup in an alley. It was a removal executed with precision. Here's what we know and what the pattern tells us. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no witness reporting panic or coercion. This almost always means one thing: he willingly met with people he trusted. Mob hits often involve someone the victim considers familiar, safe, or at least non-threatening. You don't lure a man like Spero out of his home unless he believes he's walking into conversation, not danger. When authorities found Spero's car, there was no blood, no weapon, no fingerprints out of place, no signs of forced removal inside. That's the signature of a controlled extraction. If the homicide happened inside the vehicle, there would be biological evidence. If it happened beside the vehicle, someone would have seen or heard it. Instead, the car looked like it was simply left there, purposefully, quietly, and in a location chosen to avoid attention. Disappearance hits rely on three components: trust, the victim shows up willingly; isolation, the location is chosen carefully; rural, industrial, or private property; disposal, the body is handled in a way that guarantees it will not be found. Kansas City mob history includes multiple disappearance-style hits tied to the Civellas and their associates. They were consistent, efficient, cold. If you leave a body, you leave evidence. If you erase the body, the case dies before it starts. When someone vanishes without any forensic trace, it almost never indicates a spontaneous crime. Spontaneous crimes leave chaos. They leave defensive wounds, blood, witnesses, noise. Mob removals leave nothing. And in 1973, authorities didn't have the forensic tools we expect today. No DNA databases, no mass fingerprint systems, no cell phone data, no GPS tracking, nothing to trace Spero's last path except his abandoned car. The hit wasn't designed for detectives in 1973. It was designed to beat detectives in any year. When a mob kills one of their own, they don't brag, they don't stage it, they don't send a bloody message. The message is in the disappearance itself. The Civella family had no reason to perform a dramatic hit. Spero wasn't a rival boss or a public figure. He wasn't a civilian martyr whose death would provoke public outrage. He was a mid-level figure who posed a private internal threat. For a man like that, the quiet solution is the cleanest solution. Years later, underworld sources, retired detectives, and men tied to the KC mob openly acknowledged what the public never saw. Nick Spero was killed on orders from the Civella family, not because he betrayed them, but because he might. and might is the most dangerous word in organized crime. His body has never been recovered. There is no grave, no crime scene, no final footprint. His story ends in a void because that's exactly how the organization wanted it. Nick Spero's disappearance wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of a question. How far can someone push against the Civella family and survive? Once Spero was gone, the underworld didn't pause, mourn, or speculate. It adjusted quickly, quietly, and decisively, because that's what organized crime does when a potential fracture point is removed. The aftershocks of his disappearance reshaped Kansas City's criminal landscape in ways most people never saw, but every man in the life felt. One of the biggest myths about mob hits is that they're personal. They're not. They're strategic. The removal of Nick Spero accomplished exactly what the leadership needed at a time of federal heat and internal anxiety. It reestablished the hierarchy. No one wondered who was in charge after 1973. Civella's word stood unquestioned. It shut down the Spero faction. Whatever informal influence the Spero brothers were building evaporated overnight. It tightened discipline. Men who were drifting toward independence snapped back into line. The message was unmistakable. If the organization felt threatened, even a little, you were gone. Carl Spero, Nick's brother, survived. But what followed made it clear that Nick's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. The Spero family became synonymous with the internal war nobody dared name. Carl continued to operate in the underworld, but with a different kind of gravity hanging over him. For years afterward, the Speros and their associates were targeted, intimidated, or pressured depending on what the leadership needed. This wasn't just punishment, it was narrative control. The Civellas wanted everyone to see the Speros as an example, proof of what happened when a secondary power base started forming without permission. Before Nick's disappearance, some men had been drifting, testing small acts of independence, handling money loosely, building tiny pockets of influence. After the hit, all of that stopped. People picked sides, people shut their mouths, people stayed in the lanes they were assigned. Internal stability returned because nobody wanted to be the next unmarked grave. The mafia thrives on clarity. Nick Spero's death provided it. Law enforcement had been monitoring Kansas City's mob ecosystem for years, documenting alliances, feuds, and fractures. When Spero disappeared, agents watched the ripple effect like anthropologists observing a controlled burn. The sudden discipline in the organization told investigators exactly what they needed to know. There had been an internal threat. It was removed. The family had restabilized. Without a body, there was no murder case. But in organized crime, behavioral change is evidence too. The FBI quietly logged Spero's disappearance as a strategic homicide, one they couldn't prove but didn't doubt. Unlike the murders of Johnny Lazia, the two Charlies, or Leon Jordan, Nick Spero's disappearance didn't produce headlines or public shock. He wasn't a political figure. He wasn't a front-page personality. He lived in shadows and he disappeared into them. To the average resident of Kansas City, life continued as usual. Bars stayed open, sports teams played, neighborhoods operated as they always had. But inside the machinery of the mob, everything had shifted. This was the kind of murder that didn't change history. It cemented it. With Spero gone, the Civella family moved forward into the mid-1970s with renewed control. But beneath that control lay a growing federal pressure. The wiretaps tied to the Las Vegas scam, the Teamsters connection, the River Key disputes, gambling rackets, under scrutiny. The Civellas didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. And that's the grim irony of Nick Spero's disappearance. His death solved an internal problem, but it couldn't stop the external forces that would eventually dismantle Kansas City's organized crime family altogether. Yet inside the organization, his disappearance worked. It bought time. It bought order. It reminded everyone who held the real power. And in the mafia, That's the only aftermath that matters. Nick Spero's disappearance isn't just another mob hit, it's a window into the psychology and operating structure of organized crime. If you strip away the names, the violence, and the Kansas City geography, what happened to Spero follows a pattern as old as the American mafia itself. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't rage. This was governance. To understand why Spero died, you have to understand the mindset that drives a criminal organization pretending to operate like a family, but functioning more like a corporation built on fear. The psychological core of mob leadership is simple: predictability equals safety, unpredictability equals danger. Nick Spero wasn't removed because he committed a specific offense on a specific day. He was removed because he became a variable, a man whose ambition and independence created unpredictable outcomes. In the mob, unpredictability is risk. Risk is instability, and instability threatens the entire structure. So the system rejects the variable. In legitimate institutions, consequences often align with the severity of the offense. In the mob, consequences align with the severity of the threat, real or perceived. Mob governance isn't about justice, it's about preservation. Spero's murder shows how the mafia handles internal dissent, decisively, quietly, and without negotiation. Loyalty is mandatory, but discipline is sacred. When one man threatens the balance, the organization acts to restore it. No debate necessary. The mob brands itself as a family to its members, but once you see its internal logic, it resembles something colder: a hierarchy, a bureaucracy, a system of rewards and punishments, and a closed-loop power structure. Men like Spero believed in the family enough to serve it, but the leadership believed in order more than they believed in any individual. His death proves the contradiction at the heart of mob psychology. You belong to us until you don't. Legitimate institutions rely on documentation, transparency, and accountability. The mob relies on the opposite: no paperwork, no witnesses, no body, and no answers. A disappearance isn't messy, it's policy. It keeps law enforcement at bay and keeps members obedient. The psychological power of silence is enormous. Men don't fear bullets, they fear becoming nothing. Nick Spero didn't get a headline. He got erased. That was the point. This is the part most outsiders misunderstand. When the mob kills a rival from another city, that's war. When the mob kills one of their own, that's administration. Spero's murder wasn't emotional, it wasn't symbolic, it wasn't explosive. It was a correction, a tightening of bolts in a machine that cannot tolerate loose parts. This tells you everything about how the Civella family thought in the 1970s. When the organization is under pressure, the leadership becomes more rigid, not less, and the men who step outside the lines become liabilities, not assets. Nick Spero was a problem with two possible outcomes: attempt negotiation and risk further instability. Remove him and restore order instantly. Criminal organizations don't choose the option with nuance. They choose the option with certainty. And the certainty in Nick Spero's case was lethal. In the end, Spero's disappearance wasn't just a murder, it was the mafia revealing its truest form. A system that promises brotherhood but delivers obedience. A hierarchy that preaches loyalty but demands silence. A world where ambition is admired until the wrong man shows it. Spero died because he violated the one rule that matters most: power only flows one direction, and he started climbing upstream. Nick Spero's disappearance wasn't just another Kansas City mob story. It was a snapshot of a criminal system in decline. For decades, the American mafia survived on a formula built on loyalty, hierarchy, and fear, rules that were effective when the world outside was limited, segregated, and economically constrained. But by the time Spero vanished in 1973, those old world structures were eroding, and his murder reveals exactly why the mob's traditional framework began to collapse nationwide. The violence that once secured loyalty was now pushing people away. In the early 20th century, when legitimate opportunities were scarce and immigrant neighborhoods had no safety net, The mob offered protection, income, and identity. Violence wasn't a deterrent, it was a fact of life. But by the 1970s, American society had shifted. Working class men could earn steady union wages, access education, and build real careers. The risks of mob life stayed the same: prison, betrayal, sudden death, but the rewards shrank dramatically. Men who once would have gravitated toward organized crime began choosing safer, more stable paths. Killing your own members no longer reinforced power, it demonstrated insecurity. That insecurity came from a leadership model frozen in time. The Civella family still operated with a 1930s rule book: rigid hierarchy, zero tolerance for dissent, and an unshakable belief that obedience mattered more than intelligence or innovation. While society evolved and law enforcement modernized, the mob refused to adapt. In a world of wiretaps, surveillance teams, and federal task forces, the Kansas City Mafia tried to survive with the same structures it had used during Prohibition. Rigid systems break under pressure, and the Civella organization was no exception. Nick Spero's death underscores the mob's fatal flaw. It eliminated its own future. Spero wasn't a revolutionary, he was simply ambitious, independent, and capable of drawing respect. Instead of promoting or steering men like him, old school leadership treated them as threats. The mafia had no mechanism for internal growth or modernization. When ambition surfaced, the response was violence. By killing younger, assertive figures like Spero, the mob wasn't tightening discipline, it was ensuring stagnation. The organization preserved its hierarchy at the cost of its longevity. As the financial landscape changed, the risk-to-reward ratio of mob life became impossible to justify. Rackets that once brought in steady cash were now monitored, intercepted, or dismantled by law enforcement. The Las Vegas skim was under constant scrutiny. Gambling profits were shrinking, federal sentencing grew harsher, plea deals more common, and surveillance more sophisticated. For many men, the greatest threat wasn't a rival family or the police, it was their own leadership. When criminal loyalty guarantees danger but no longer guarantees profit, the entire system begins to collapse. Nick Spero's disappearance was not an act of strength, it was an act of fear. Mob hits inside the organization rarely signal control, they signal fracture. When leadership resorts to killing its own associates, it means the hierarchy feels threatened, not secure. The Civella family silenced Spero to preserve order, but the silence itself revealed their vulnerability. Internal violence is a symptom of decay, not dominance. The FBI recognized this immediately. Surveillance didn't capture a confident, unified organization. It captured men arguing, gossiping, panicking, and scrambling. Federal agents didn't dismantle the Kansas City mob by outsmarting it. The mob's own paranoia and internal dysfunction did most of the work. The government simply documented the collapse as it unfolded. In the end, Nick Spero's fate reflects the larger truth about why the old mob model died. The mafia didn't fail because law enforcement suddenly became unbeatable. It failed because it refused to evolve. A system built on fear cannot survive in a society that offers people safer, more prosperous alternatives. A hierarchy that eats its own members eventually runs out of men willing to keep it alive. Spero's disappearance wasn't just the elimination of a problem. It was a signpost marking the end of an era, a reminder that the mob's greatest enemy was never the FBI. It was its own inability to change. When you stack Nick Spero's disappearance against other major mob murders in Kansas City, a clear pattern emerges, but so do the differences that make his case stand out. Each high-profile hit in KC tells you something about the era, the leadership, and the message the organization wanted to send. Spero's murder fits that tradition, but it also marks a turning point that separates the old mob world from the one crumbling beneath federal pressure. Take Johnny Lazia in 1934. His assassination was a spectacle: machine gun fire, hospital steps, public chaos. It was designed to send a message not just to the underworld but to the entire city. Lazia's murder was political theater, a demonstration of shifting alliances and rising tensions in Prohibition-era Kansas City. Everything about it was loud, intentional, and meant to be noticed. Then there's the Benicio Gargata double murder in 1950. That hit had a different purpose. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about accountability. Benicio had overplayed his political hand and Gargata stood too close to him. Their bodies found in a political club sent an unmistakable warning: when you fail the organization or jeopardize its stability, the consequences are immediate. Their deaths were internal discipline made public. Even the killing of Leon Jordan in 1970, though more complicated, carried overt political implications. It was a surgical strike carried out in the open, intended to shape Kansas City's balance of power. Jordan's murder operated at the intersection of organized crime, local politics, and community influence. It was high stakes and high visibility. Nick Spero's disappearance has none of those signatures. There was no spectacle, no public shock, no instant headline. It was a private correction, performed in silence, protected by internal loyalty, and erased before anyone outside the life even realized he was gone. His case represents the kind of mob hit that was never meant for newspapers. It was operational, not theatrical, administrative, not symbolic. And that's where the comparison becomes most revealing. The early KC mob wasn't afraid to send public messages with bodies. By the time Spero vanished, that had changed. The Civella family didn't need noise. They needed stability. They didn't need to intimidate the streets. They needed to control their own house. The absence of a body speaks volumes about how the organization had shifted. It wasn't about demonstrating power. It was about removing a variable with as little collateral damage as possible. Spero's murder also differs in purpose. Lazia's death reshuffled power. The Benicio Gargata murders corrected a political overreach. Leon Jordan's assassination altered the city's political landscape. But Spero? His disappearance wasn't about external influence. It was about internal maintenance. He represented a potential splinter, a fracture that could grow under the weight of FBI scrutiny. Eliminating him didn't change the city, it just tightened the screws inside the organization. If you compare the psychology behind these hits, the trajectory becomes clear. Early murders were about dominance. Mid-century murders were about control. But by the 1970s, murders like Spero's were about survival. The mob was shrinking inward, more paranoid, more methodical, more afraid of losing itself from the inside than being toppled by an enemy from the outside. Spero's case shows the difference between a mob confident in its growth and a mob bracing for collapse. His disappearance didn't redefine Kansas City's criminal future the way the earlier murders did. Instead, it confirmed what insiders already saw coming. The organization was tightening, hardening, and drifting into a late-stage rigidity that would eventually crack under the pressure of federal investigations and internal decay. That's why Spero's murder doesn't sit beside the others as a moment that shaped Kansas City. It sits beneath them, as the quiet thud of an organization killing part of itself to stay alive just a little longer. Nick Spero didn't disappear because he was the most dangerous man in Kansas City. He disappeared because he was the kind of man the mob feared most, someone inside the organization who stopped accepting the limits placed on him. His story isn't a cautionary tale about ambition or betrayal. It's a reminder of what happens when a closed system starts to collapse under its own weight. In the end, Spero wasn't killed by a rival or a federal sting or a street war. He was killed by the very world he committed himself to, an organization that promised loyalty but survived by eliminating anyone who threatened its fragile balance. His absence is the echo of a framework that was already dying, one silent removal at a time. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If this episode opened a corner of Kansas City's history you've never heard before, follow, rate, and share the show on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps bring forgotten chapters back into the light. Research and narration is always done by me. Sources for this episode include historical Kansas City Star archives, FBI surveillance summaries, federal organized crime investigations, and documented accounts of Kansas City's mafia hierarchy. And remember, the